Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Andrea Carlise. I'm the Executive Director of the International Action Network for Gender, Equity, and Law, which goes by the acronym IANGEL. Thank you all for joining us today and welcome to this webinar on supporting minor survivors of human trafficking, actually legal support for minor survivors of human trafficking. Let's get started. Let me tell you a little bit before I introduce our first presenter. Let me tell you a little bit about IANGEL, which is a nonprofit organization based in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm actually broadcasting here from the city of Alameda, California, which is where our office is. The mission of IANGEL is to harness the power of pro bono attorneys toward the cause of gender equity and equality, locally, nationally, and globally. And we do this through education, advocacy, and pro bono engagement in the focus areas of reproductive justice, peace and security, and women and girls empowerment. One of our current projects on the reproductive justice end is a teen information project on reproductive justice, which is a curriculum we've developed to teach high school age students about their legal rights relating to reproduction. As you know, they're very precarious at this time, and we think we would like to be educating the next generation of advocates for bodily autonomy and reproductive justice. That's just one of our events. You can check us out at, or one of our projects. You can check us out at iangel.org to learn more about us. Over the last several years, human trafficking has also been a primary focus of our advocacy and education, and hence this event. We are proud to be a partner with the Alameda County DA's office on a grant they received from the Department of Justice. And other partners on this grant are here presenting with us today, and the DA's office actually presented yesterday. So let me introduce now our first presenter. It's my pleasure to introduce Andrea Diaz. She is the Training and Prevention Manager with Motivating, Inspiring, Supporting, and Serving Sexually Exploited Youth, which goes by the acronym MISSSEY. As the Training and Prevention Manager, Andrea advocates and supports youth through education. She loves being in the community and working towards creating safer spaces for youth to navigate. She offers outreach, information, and collaboration. She's a certified domestic violence counselor and has served as a case manager, SFPD liaison, and education manager. She is passionate about working with women and youth and learning how to best build support for and around them. So today she's going to be speaking to us about how to strengthen attorney-client relationships with trauma survivors by understanding their trauma and also focusing on the unique trauma of survivors who were trafficked as minors. So welcome, Andrea. Thanks so much for being with us, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Andrea. Good morning, y'all. My name is Andrea. I am with MISSSEY. I am going to share my screen with you all and lead through this presentation. If anything isn't making sense, if you would like to know a little bit more or have me further explain, please feel free to drop your questions. I'll also try to have some pauses every few slides to check in and see if anybody has any questions. I am with MISSSEY. We have been around for over a decade serving youth. Our services and the way that we provide service has developed and changed as we've learned more, as we have seen what is working and what is best serving young people and what isn't. So as much as we are out leading trainings and education opportunities, we ourselves are also learning in this work regularly. We did start off as just doing crisis response, and while we still support young people through crisis, our services have also expanded to include long-term care and long-term support. We have intensive case management. We have a drop-in center. I'll talk a little bit more about some of our services. Our STAR Center, we are actually gearing up to open it back up at the same capacity that we were at prior to the shelter in place. But throughout the shelter in place, we have been providing services at our drop-in center still. Still providing meals. We were providing a lot of groceries, as well as providing food and different things like that via the delivery apps. We are also have a YES specialist, which is the youth engagement specialist located at the Alameda County Foster Care Center. And that's really a lot of preventative work. We know that young people who are in foster care have a high probability of being exploited. So we want to make sure that we are talking to them early on, trying to get information and education out to them, and at least building rapport and relationship with them. So if they are being groomed, if they become even more high risk, or if they are exploited, they know who they can come back and talk to. And then we have our leadership and advocacy program, which really supports our young people in exploring their voice, especially young people who want to take part in this work, who are considering, any role within the human trafficking movement, really supporting them in developing those skills, exploring opportunities out there. And then the other part is having opportunities like this to come out and talk to those that are serving young people, to ensure that they are aware of what comes up for the youth that we serve, so young people aren't being re-traumatized and recycled through the different power and control disbalances that they're already usually experiencing in their day-to-day. So today we are going to talk about being trauma-informed, the continuum of abuse, and then as well as some of our healing-centered practices. So what does being trauma-informed mean? And that's both as individuals as well as an organization, right? Because we can be trauma-informed, but if the organization that we are a part of has a lot of protocols and processes in place that are not trauma-informed, it's not going to have the same impact. And in some ways, it's not going to matter, right? If we're still kind of moving through these processes that are re-traumatizing. So being trauma-informed really just means that as a caregiver, you recognize the impact of trauma on an individual, right? You acknowledge that there are biological, neurological, psychological, social, and spiritual effects that have taken place and that continue to have impact on that individual. Trauma-informed really helps us shift our perspective and the way that we're looking at the way we're providing service, from asking the question of what is wrong with you to what happened, right? What's happening right now, right? Rather than moving from a place of judgment and moving from a place of labeling, it really asks us to get curious. Five core concepts of being trauma-informed include providing safety and stability, trustworthiness, cultural humility, collaboration, and having voice and choice for those we serve. And we'll go through each one. So safety and stability. So safety is somatic. We feel safe or we don't. We cannot think ourselves into safety. So it's really important that when somebody isn't feeling safe, we're not just trying to move from like the mental place of trying to get them to know that they're safe, because we don't know we're safe in our head. We know we're safe in our body, because you can tell me you're trustworthy, you can tell me that I'm in a safe space, but if I don't feel safe, it doesn't matter what you're telling me. So really inviting conversation around what is safety for somebody, considering that individual's experience and what could be triggering for them, and doing our best to ensure physical and emotional safety. Things like this can include location. So where are we meeting them? Are we meeting them near areas where exploitation and where they may be identified, where their exploiters may be? Are we meeting them in areas with individuals that they don't feel safe around in general? How are we sitting in a space with them, right? Our posture can say a lot. Are we standing over them? Are we making eye contact? Are we blocking doorways and exits so that if they're starting to feel uncomfortable, are we allowing them to feel like they are in control of their experience there? And then how are we also creating opportunity to move at a human pace, right? I know that, oftentimes we're limited on time. We have a lot of different things going on, but sometimes that moving from that space of like, I need this now and I need you to tell me and I need to get through this, creates this sense of urgency and stress, right? And how does that add to somebody not feeling safe and not feeling stable and not feeling like they can talk to you anymore? So really allowing for life to happen, right? If somebody is late to an appointment, if somebody misses an appointment, it's not about not having accountability, but it is about creating a space that's safe enough that allows for people to be human, right? And if, hey, I know you're late. I know that, whatever happened, I do have another appointment, but, let's really make these next 15, 20 minutes count. Let's really, see what we can do, or let's look at what another time, or, is it the location? Is there somewhere else I can meet you that would make it easier so that you're not having to, maybe travel so much to get to me? So how are we really considering that? Those are the places that we also invite safety for people. And then also creating agreements with them right at the beginning, asking them what their needs are. If you start the conversation and you, every time you're checking in, just making sure that they're all right. And if they need anything, just creates that open line of communication. So if anything does come up for them, they will feel comfortable enough to be able to talk to you. But it really takes a lot from us initially to set that up and make sure that we are being open and receptive to what they're saying. And then creating that stability, right? Showing up when we say we're going to, not making promises that we can't. We have boundaries, both professional and personal, and it's really important that we honor those for ourselves and for the young people that we serve. When we say things that we are not going to be able to follow through on, we're just creating false promises, and that doesn't make us stable. That doesn't make us trustworthy anymore. So how are we ensuring that we're honoring our boundaries as well as honoring the boundary with those youth that we're working with? It's also a great way to model boundaries. Trustworthiness. So being trustworthy over trust. Right? A lot of times we move from a place of, I have good intentions. I know I'm a good person. I know that I'm not here to harm anybody. You should just trust me. But that's actually pretty unhealthy. If somebody's just trusting you off bat because you tell them that they should trust you, we're actually asking them to override some natural things that should be taking place, right? So how are we showing up as trustworthy individuals and building up on that trust with the youth that we're serving? Right? How are we being honest and genuine, maintaining appropriate boundaries? How are we also continuing that same, maintaining that appropriateness and that honesty when they're not in the room with us? How do we show up for young people when they're not around? And that's one of the biggest ways to build up trust with somebody. Being who you say you are, and what you say you're going to do, even when they're not in front of you. Right? Young people can really read when you're showing up in a false way. They have a great measure to that. So how are we really doing our part that even when we don't see them and even when they don't see us, we're still advocating for them. We're still following through on those commitments. And also I think in that, really validating that, hey, I know we just met. I'm here to support you. I'm here to provide help. I'm not asking for trust off bat. We can do good work. We can provide services. We can do all the things without that young person trusting us off bat, right? How are we really giving the space and the time to build into that relationship? Any questions on those first two? All right. Cultural humility. So cultural humility, when the idea around being informed about individuals really came about, it was initially named cultural competency, right? There was this idea that like you were going to learn and then that was it, like you just understood. But the truth is that it's a lifelong commitment, right? You're never going to really end learning about others, learning about different people's identities and how they intersect and how they impact each other, and then how they impact the relationships that we may be engaging with them in. So recognizing that we're always learning and always being, I think, humble enough to be open to that process, as well as recognizing and challenging power imbalances, right? Those intersections that exist of people's identities, and how, power exists. Power in itself is not a bad word, right? Power can be actually quite beautiful, but how are we using our power? How are we sharing our power? And how are we also kind of checking that power in instances which we may have power over, right? As providers, being a provider, being somebody that holds knowledge, that holds service, that holds access and resource, already creates a power imbalance just automatically, right? So how are we really aware of that, right? How do people, when someone's showing up, they're like, well, if I want to access these things, if I want to access this help, then I have to make sure that this person is okay with me. And how does that impact the way somebody's being able to show up, and what they feel they can say yes or no to, what they feel they have a right to, right? That those things just exist. So how can we acknowledge that and do our best to share that power, and make sure that other person knows their rights, knows that they have agency within this space, within this relationship. And then establishing institutional accountability, right? Going back to that piece of, we can hold all the cultural humility, we can have all the trauma-informed knowledge, but if we are working within organizations and within processes that in themselves are traumatizing, or really create this big power imbalance, it's not going to happen. So how are we also challenging the institutions that we work within? Because that's definitely often, as providers, one of the places we hold power that oftentimes some clients that we serve may not. All right, collaboration. Ooh, this one didn't change over. Sorry about that. But collaboration, how are we collaborating with the young people that we serve, right? How are we ensuring that they are completely informed and they are fully informed of their choices and options? Another place where the power dynamics can come in, how are we not weighing our own personal preferences into the way we're presenting choices and options, right? Sometimes without meaning to, we might really want something, or we might think that a certain decision would be the best decision for an individual. And we might just, the way we present it might be more excited, and we might provide more information, and we might really start skewing the way that person receives that opportunity. Or sometimes we won't present other opportunities because we just think that's not the best choice. But how are we being transparent? How are we just saying like, hey, these are all your choices and your options, and just presenting them for that individual to ask questions, to seek information, and to then move from a place that is authentic to them. I know that it can sometimes feel like we may know what's best, or we have an understanding, but rather than moving from a space of like, well, I know more, how are we sharing that knowledge with them so they know just as much? So they have just as much understanding of what options we're giving them, and making that information accessible. Because what we don't know, while we may understand, maybe in this situation law, while we may understand the impacts of that, what we don't know is their full life. We may be hearing about the trauma this individual is experiencing, or we may be hearing about this one experience, but they have a whole life lived and a whole life yet to live. And we don't know about all those pieces of it. So there's no way that we can make the best choices from them from knowing a sliver of what they are and who they are as a person. So really being willing to be honest and collaborate with them. So because they ultimately do know what's best, because they know themselves best. They know their situation best, and they know oftentimes also the exploiter best. All right, and voice and choice. So again, providing opportunity for young people to speak, right, or individuals to speak, to share, to be able to ask questions. Informed consent is really just that, right? Giving information, presenting all the options, inviting questions, right? Really letting them know, like, hey, you can ask if something doesn't make sense. Even if it sounds like I think you should know, by all means, ask the questions. And then as providers, how are we seeking understanding, right? Are we asking the questions that ensure that individual understands what is being presented to them? And then listening for agreement. Do we just kind of present it and they maybe nod their head, or maybe they didn't say anything in return and we take silence as a yes or silence as a no? But how are we really asking and listening for agreement? That they understand what is being asked, what their choices are, and then they're making a very conscious and informed decision on that. And really, again, coming back to trying to not influence or sway the decision one way or another. Another part of voice and choice, and something that we use a lot in our work, is harm reduction. Harm reduction can feel really difficult for people sometimes. A lot of times individuals feel like they may be actually, enabling somebody by practicing harm reduction. But the truth is, if somebody wants to engage in a certain activity, they're going to engage in it. Right? We're not going to be able to really stop anybody from engaging in whatever it is. What we can do is, again, make sure that they're informed, that they know what can happen and what supports are in place in whatever they choose to engage, right? Harm reduction sometimes can feel very far off and can feel, again, like a really difficult thing to practice, but we all practice harm reduction regularly. I don't know how many of you get in cars. Yes, cars are like a leading way that people die. It's like top. It's right up there, if not the number one. But we use seatbelts, right? And we have traffic lights and traffic signs. And those are all examples of harm reduction. Does it mean that they guarantee full safety? No, but they reduce harm, right? So we all engage in risky behavior day to day. But there are also things in place that can keep us safer. And how are we kind of holding that same space for young people, right? That may be engaging in behavior that is high risk. And how are we presenting opportunities for them to stay safer within those high risk situations? And also, presenting them with all the options and all the information out there about the choices they're making from a non-judgmental space. All right, any questions on any of those? All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about intersectionality, complex trauma, and then the continuum of sexual abuse. So complex trauma is multi-layered throughout life and often has multiple sources. Trauma, I'm sure you all, to some extent have some understanding of trauma. And while the young people we serve and while the individuals who are being trafficked have experiences with trauma, most of them are actually experiencing complex trauma. And I think it's definitely important to know that there is a difference, right? Trauma generally comes from an instance of a one-time occurrence, right? Something that happened one time, and then we have the trauma. Complex trauma is multi-layered. There are multiple instances. And a lot of the people that we're engaging with are also experiencing continuous trauma, which is trauma that they're still currently experiencing, right? We're not always helping somebody who is no longer being trafficked or no longer being exploited. Sometimes we're helping individuals who are still being exploited and still being trafficked. So they're also still experiencing that trauma. So how are we really holding space and deepening our understanding of what it means to really have empathy and compassion for somebody who has experienced trauma since often really early on in childhood and is continuing to experience it, right? Oftentimes somebody's coming to our office right after having left their exploiter, or they're going to leave our office and have to go see their exploiter. And that's going to create a completely different way that they're going to be able to engage with us and the way that they're showing up. And how are we really considerate of that? Complex trauma comes from multiple sources. It can be individual and interpersonal, systemic and institutional, intergenerational, as well as from community and society. And knowing all this, right, it's important to also name that, this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? I'm not sure if you all spoke about this yesterday, but this trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's really the result of those systems of oppression and communities that are already being under-resourced and marginalized, which is why we know that across the nation, youth that are most likely to be exploited are Black girls, Native girls, followed by other youth of color, right, as well as youth that are part of the LGBTQ plus community. So knowing that this intersections of identities are already leaving youth more vulnerable, how are all these things also continuing to impact the way that they're able to access our services, access support, and also how their experience is being presented to them? With that, right, we know that human trafficking is an intersection of many social inequities. And so when we're talking about the intersection of identities, we're really talking about intersectionality, right? And I'm not going to go too into it, but if you want to look up Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, there's a lot of really good reading to kind of inform us and really better support us in understanding how the intersection of identities really impacts how we access the world, right? And how that access to the world is going to impact how we engage with others, how we receive services, what services we feel we have a right and access to, and then really keeping that all in mind when we're providing services to individuals. So the continuum of sexual abuse. So all exploitation, all commercial sexual exploitation, all sex trafficking is a form of sexual abuse. Not all sexual abuse is exploitation. A way that we could maybe talk about that or consider that is say that there is a teacher who takes pictures of a student and inappropriate pictures of a student, that would be sexual abuse. And then if they shared those pictures out, that would be exploitation. And then if they uploaded those pictures and started selling them, now we're talking about commercial sexual exploitation. And it's important that we consider all that. A lot of the young people, throughout just different research, most young people that end up being trafficked have over 90% experience. Over 90% have experienced some form of sexual abuse, usually prior to age 18. So knowing that their experience of trafficking is usually part of like a long history of sexual abuse, and it's in the continuum. And so this can make sometimes how they're defining their experience and how they've defined past experiences really blurry, right? And also create a different level of support and maybe understanding than they might need. And this isn't to say that you necessarily have to hold all this understanding and then explain everything to them, but how are we ensuring that individuals we're serving are connected to the services and connected to the support so that they're able to kind of understand this for themselves and are able to maybe better define their experiences and better understand their experiences as they're navigating through everything. Because otherwise we're going to kind of like just take care of one thing and not take care of the full history. And that's part of what being trauma informed is, right? Really supporting somebody throughout that history of trauma. And again, not that we have to be responsible for that, but being able to understand that there is more than just what we are currently talking about that exist. And that whether, we mean to or not, that has impact on individuals. So what are some of the ways that we can support individuals who are facing, all these different layers and who we are trying to best support and share some of that power with? So having positive engagement with individuals is really important. So non-judgmental and being person-centered. And being person-centered just means remembering that people are whole people, right? Again, not being so focused just on the trauma that we forget that a whole individual exists. Being consistent, right? Creating stability. A lot of individuals who are being trafficked do not have stability or consistency. So being able to know that, hey, if I come here, this is going to be my experience. This is where I'm meeting them. This is, that really starts creating some of that stability and actually supports that internal regulation as well. Having an environment as well as positive, and that creates positive reinforcement as well as individual positive reinforcement. A trauma-informed model of care. So again, this is more on the organizational piece. How is people within the organization informed of what it means to be trauma-informed? How does our questionnaires and the forms we're having individuals fill out, how are those trauma-informed? From the person who answers the phone to the person who's providing, the direct service. How does everybody have some level of training and understanding? Having unconditional positive regard. This can get also another one that can be kind of tricky for people. A lot of times, I always say, if you're not ready to get cussed out by a young person or by an individual, then this may not be the work for you. This may not be where you want to provide service. We're being able to have somebody become dysregulated and have that emotion show up in a way that may feel a little like, oh, I wasn't trying to do that, or I didn't maybe deserve to be yelled at or cussed out or whatever it may be, and then having them show up the next day and be able to just say, hey, how are you? How's it going today? And it's not that we don't get to have feelings, and it's not that we don't get to even address what happened, right? And have boundaries, right? We get to have boundaries and say like, hey, I didn't appreciate getting yelled at like that, but let's talk about it. What happened? What did what happened? What was the trigger? How do we, ensure that you're not feeling like, you have to be at battle with me because, I'm trying to support you. Again, unconditional positive regard does not mean lack of accountability and lack of boundaries, but it does mean being able to still show up, right? It does mean not, disregarding that young person and, when they leave, telling your coworker how rude and how volatile they are, and that, you just don't know how they're going to get any help. Right? It's still being able to hold space that this is somebody who has a high level of trauma, who is often still navigating the situation of harm, and that this is sometimes the only safe space for them to have any genuine reaction. Right? They're often in spaces and with individuals where it's not safe to express how they're feeling. Right? From buyers to exploiters that can become violent and aggressive, right? Those aren't safe spaces to express feelings. And you might be the only safe space that they have that, and being able to kind of hold that and be able to support them through that. And then improve systemic collaboration and response. So again, how are we making sure that they are connected to other services, that they have access to other resources? Because this isn't something that only one of us is going to be able to carry through, right? We need a lot of support from one another. So who do I know I can call if I'm working with a young person and they do become dysregulated, or they have been missing for a while and I haven't heard from them? And, where can I reach out to and see if, maybe they have? What are those places that if someone needs some added mental health support, I can reach out and connect that young person to? So you don't have to know everyone and you don't have to know everything, but if you can at least have one or two numbers for that extra support, it really also helps take off some of that load for you. You don't have to be responsible for those people. There are other organizations, there are other people who really focus in on that work, and it allows you to connect them with a professional and somebody that's going to be able to support them adequately, and it lets you really concentrate and hone in on your work with that young person and really focus on what it is that you can do for them. Changing the language. So from the way that we talk to and talk about young people, it can have a big impact not only on the individual, right? Words are powerful. So if we start hearing something over and over and we're depicted in a negative light, it definitely has an impact on how we are then able to show up and how we view ourselves. But then also in the way that we're able to provide service. So there's no such thing as like a teen prostitute or a young prostitute. Even for adults who we are supporting, for those that are over 18, a prostitute is what they're charged. Prostitution is what they're charged with. So just regardless of what you may say and what you may think in terms of the word and say, well, I don't think that, a prostitute is a negative thing. It's a criminal term. So whether you are meaning to or not, whether you have that intention or not, you are already calling somebody a criminal. So just being really aware that that language has an impact and carries weight. Also, when we are engaging with individuals who may, have behaviors that show up in this way, right? And naming these being defiant, argumentative, dishonest, those are behaviors, right? And how are we able to hold that as a behavior and not label the person, right? Somebody can show up in an argumentative way. Somebody can show up and not really be open to change at the time. But that doesn't mean that they are a defiant person or that they are dishonest. Really separating the behavior from the person. And when we do that, we're able to hold more compassion and more grace. And we're also able to get curious, right? If somebody isn't willing to open up, right, and you feel that they're lying, and they may be lying, rather than being like, well, they're just liars. Well, what am I doing that doesn't make them feel safe enough to tell me the truth? What is it about this engagement that they don't feel like they can trust me to tell me the truth? What else could happen if they tell me the truth? Right? How are we getting curious and asking, and also asking ourselves, like, what is maybe our role in why this behavior is showing up? And it's not that we are to blame for it, but what can we maybe offer to encourage a different behavior? So bad language ultimately leads to bad perspective, which ultimately leads to bad practice. You're not going to have this whole discussion with a coworker or with yourself about somebody, about how much of a liar and how much you're not looking forward, and then show up and give them your best service and be the best you can be for them. That's not how that works. And again, it's not to deny that we can't have frustrations and we can't have feelings, but really knowing that those are mine. Those frustrations are mine. They don't need to be imposed onto the person that I'm providing service with. And how can I work through my stuff so I can show up for those that I'm providing service for? All right, so power dynamics, back to power. So with all this, right, knowing that we do hold some innate power in the positions that we're at, usually serving young people. And we just really want to be aware that we're not having power over, right? So we're not forcing, we're not being authoritative, we're not manipulating and influencing, but we're collaborating, facilitating conversations, being in community with individuals, because ultimately we hope that those we are serving can find the integrity and purpose within, really build up their capacity and presence to self-advocate and to then be able to move from agency, right, from personal agency. Survivors are often, experiencing a lot of situations where somebody has power over them, right? From exploiters to buyers to providers. So how are we ensuring that we operate from a power with, so that we are not recreating those cycles that they're already experiencing, right? Otherwise, we're really, being we're not being honest, because if we tell somebody like, you don't, you are deserving to, have agency and you are deserving to make choices for yourself, but then we sit in a room with them and we present them with half options because we think we know best, because we think we know better, because, they don't really understand, they're not going to believe us, You're telling me one thing, but you're behaving in a completely different way. Right? You're telling me that I should, be able to make choice and I should be able to feel safe, but you're making the choices for me. You're telling me I'm not capable enough, which is often what exploiters are telling young people as well. Yes. Thank you, Rose. Rose had put in that we see service providers do this all the time. And we do. And it's where the piece of like well-intentioned individuals can often cause a lot of harm, right? Because you might have the best intentions in the world, but when those intentions don't line up with the positive action, then it doesn't matter because the impact ends up being harmful. So empowerment, this word gets used a lot and we bring it in. We don't really talk a lot about empowering young people, and part of it is just because it became such a catchphrase. But empowerment has to do with autonomy, right? Like I am empowered. I feel empowered. Somebody can be empowered. We cannot empower somebody, right? That is opposite of what the definition is. But with that, if we are hoping that individuals find empowerment for themselves, some of the things that we definitely want to make sure that we're not doing is that we're not rescuing, right? We don't rescue or save anybody. We're not giving advice. We are not trying to show somebody that we're an expert. We're not always right? We're vulnerable and we, own up to our mistakes. We don't impose our own agenda, goals, or values, right? And those are some of the big ones, right? Sometimes our values and our ideas of what is, our definitions of what is right, what is wrong, what somebody should want, right? Even that, I think sometimes the idea of like what somebody should hope for or want for may be very different than what that the individual we're serving wants for themselves. And how are, we able to kind of hold our own pieces and our own agendas to ourselves and not impose them onto anybody. We do want individuals to act on their own authority. We want to make sure that we're asking for permission whenever we're looking to collaborate with somebody else, even if it's individuals within our own agencies. Sometimes we can move from a place of like, well, I know this person and I trust this person, so I'm going to go ask them for advice, or I'm going to go, make sure that, have them support me. But how are we ensuring that the person we're serving is okay with that, right? Maybe they told you information and they told you their story and they're telling you all these things, and they told you. They didn't tell your colleague, they didn't tell your partner, they didn't tell anybody else, they told you. So if you're going to be sharing parts of somebody's story, parts of somebody's information, how are you first checking in with that individual that it's okay, right? And if there are things you're going to be sharing out because you need to share out, because how are you being transparent about who you will be sharing that information with, right? Again, how are you building trust? Because if I told you and you told me, this is confidential and you're not going to tell, but then 3 other people walk into the room and they know all about everything I told you, then when did you go tell them? And who else knows? And who else out there knows about me that I don't know? So making sure that we're being transparent and asking for permission whenever we're sharing out our clients' information. And then supporting them unconditionally, right? Coming back to that unconditional positive regard, right? A lot of times individuals who are trafficked or are given very little space to make mistakes and very little space for errors. And we all make mistakes. We all have our days where it's not working for us. And so how are we, again, holding that capacity? Just, hey, yeah, we said that wasn't going to happen, or we said we were going to try to do this better and it didn't. And now what do we do, right? How do we move from this space into maybe being able to better support that? Any questions on this? Any of these slides? So some messages that are survivor informed of some of the best ways to provide support. Knowing that I may not self-identify as a victim or survivor. And I know that that can get tricky when we're moving forward with wanting to really like label, right? So we know what kind of support we can give them, or we know what they need. But it's complex, right? Their experience, right? We're going back to that continuum, right? Some of those experiences might have been defined really differently for them. The idea of choice, especially for individuals who are older, really comes up. How we are explaining, or how choice has been explained to them, right? Sometimes they think like, well, a gun wasn't being held to my head, so therefore I chose to. And it's like, well, there's coercion, and there's, a lot of different ways that we don't choose, yet we are still like compelled to do certain things. So how, are we providing opportunities for them to seek further understanding, and being able to support them the best we can from wherever they may be in their current journey of understanding their experiences. Know that you don't rescue or save me. Focus on what I need now, not what has happened to me, right? And again, that trauma-informed piece, and being person-centered, right? We know that individuals are coming with trauma. We want to hold space and compassion for that. We want to have understanding that this is going to impact somebody. But how are we not just, kind of getting pulled into all the details of what happened, and forgetting that they need support in this moment? And that the support that they need in this moment may have nothing to do with some of the details. There may be some things we need to know, but also where are we right now, and what is needed now? And how are we not just getting sucked into wanting to know what occurred? Listen to what I am saying I need. Don't tell me what I need. Right? Again, just providing choices, making sure they're informed, and then following them as they're navigating through that. Educate me, tell me what trafficking looks like, but don't define my experience. Provide me with options and real opportunities, and increase my access to safety, even if you think you might be enabling me, right? And so that's that harm reduction. And just kind of finishing off a little bit with that, provide me with options and real opportunities as we're working with you, and as we're working with individuals, and we're trying to, access safety and access different options, and making sure that we're not making these broad statements of, well, this is, you don't have to go back, or you don't have to do this, or I'm going to make sure that you have this, or I'm going to make sure that you get this. Those aren't real viable options often, right? How are we actually speaking from a place of what we know, what we have access to, and what we can, follow through on? A lot of individuals know that, no, I can't just leave my exploiter tomorrow, because where would I go? Are you going to take them home to live with you? Are you going to provide them with food and clothing and access to work and training and ongoing support? Probably not, right? And there's very few, or there's many organizations that can do that, but that takes planning, and that takes coordination, and that takes, communicating with all these different places and building out that plan. Also knowing that when somebody is leaving a situation of exploitation, the risk and their safety really goes up, right? Exploiters are violent. And so how are we making sure that we're, prioritizing safety, and prioritizing them really getting needs met, both immediate, and then if they're making choices, how are we supporting them with all the other pieces that they need to be able to move forward in their choices, and not making, these promises or these statements that aren't really valid. Because ultimately what that does, it creates false understanding, but then it also dwindles down on trust. You told me that this is what was going to happen, and you told me that this is how you were going to help me, and that didn't, and you didn't come through, right? You didn't follow through on those things. So now I'm not going to trust you, even with the things that you can do, because you lied to me. So just kind of keeping in mind that those are the places that are really opportunities to build trust, when we're being really honest, really transparent, and not creating false expectations with the youth that we serve, or the individuals that we serve. So, ultimately, just, it's not, to be really trauma informed, to really move from being healing centered, it's definitely more than, a one, time 60-minute presentation, but hopefully, it started off some internal dialogues and some internal conversations about maybe some of the areas that you maybe want to strengthen, right? Maybe some areas that you're like, man, I really need to work on, my compassion, or, I really actually maybe need to build up some of that cultural humility. Those are things that are maybe newer to me, or that I feel that I can go more in depth on. And definitely, doing that reading, listening to individuals. I think one of the best places to learn is with those we serve, right? And really letting them guide us and teach us is one of the best ways to learn how to be there and how to show up for them. But if y'all have any questions, I am happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I have not seen any questions, but as Rose said, this was a fabulous presentation, and it's so important to really meet the client survivors where they are and have an understanding about how to do that. So I think your presentation really helped. A lot of pro bono attorneys have never who haven't done this before, have never represented clients in these circumstances. So it's really important to know this information. So thank you so much. Can you stop?
I can, and I did want to just share that we do client consultation. So if you're ever working with somebody and you're learning how to navigate and you're learning how to best engage with individuals, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to provide support. If that individual maybe isn't ready to connect with us, you just want some support so that you can best provide service, we're happy to provide client consultations and kind of help navigate those different situations and instances.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here. So now we are going to move on to the second half of our webinar today. And it's my pleasure to introduce again Rose Mukhar. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, Rose is the founder, executive director, and principal attorney at Justice at Last. She's a social justice, human rights, and crime victims' rights attorney. And her work in creating Justice at Last was to expand legal services and outreach to trafficked survivors, including immigration relief, legal advocacy of crime victims' rights, expungement of criminal records, divorce, custody, and restraining orders. And Rose is inspired by the strength, courage, and grace of her clients, and we're happy to have her here today, and she's going to tell us more about her work and about crime victims' rights in representing survivors. So welcome, Rose.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea, for this opportunity, and thank you all for showing up for round 2 of the training. I'm just honored and delighted to be a part of this, and my hat off to you and Andrea for setting this all up. You've had phenomenal presenters, and I hope everybody's enjoying and learning a lot. And thank you, Andrea, for that. Just on point in terms of, as a pro bono attorney who might not be familiar with doing direct service with a youth or a young person who's coming from that particular background, is so critical to understand and to be trauma informed and not just say those words, but to actually live it and do it. So I'm glad to be here. Today, we're going to talk about the legal needs and remedies of trafficked persons and focus specifically on crime victim rights. And we're going to just highlight what Justice at Last does and then go straight into it. So Justice at Last, we're a legal service provider. Our services are free. We are in 14 counties throughout the Bay Area, and we're exclusively working with survivors of human trafficking. So regardless of whether they were sex and or labor trafficked, regardless if they identify as female or male or gender nonconforming, US citizen or foreign national, and regardless of the age. Our oldest client, 77, when they were first trafficked, our youngest client was 11. So, and our practice is mobile, and we did that primarily to be trauma informed. Like, we wanted to meet the client where they were. We didn't want to have to put the burden on them to come to us and to go into a law firm type setting, to feel unsafe, to feel, unsure about where they're at. If they're already working with a service provider and they feel safe and comfortable there, that's where we want to meet our clients. And we're also trying to be mindful of the cost involved with travel and the time, and they might have a family and children that they need a babysitter for. So that's our approach about why we are a mobile legal practice. This is the staff that we have, and so we're legal, so we're providing legal services. However, we work in tandem with our case managers, client advocates, and they're protected under the attorney-client privilege, which is critical for the work that we're doing. Because we find that when we're providing legal services, if the individual is not stable, if they don't have secured housing, if they don't have income, they can't feed their children, they're not going to be focused on whatever the legal need is. Even for minors, young persons who have children, they're going to focus on, how can I feed my own child? Where am I going to sleep tonight? They're not going to focus on the legal issue. They're not going to care if they've got a subpoena to turn up and testify in court against their trafficker. So our advocates work closely with our clients to help stabilize them and get those immediate needs met. So, and not just met, but then also stable, so that we can work with them to move forward on their legal cases. But the takeaway from the training that we just had, just because we've been doing this work for years, we're by no means an expert. And again, hats off to Andrea, because the person with lived experience is the expert. They're going to know what's best for them. And so our role as an attorney is to help them understand what their rights are and give them enough information and tools so they can make those choices for themselves, so they can decide what justice is going to look like for them. And so, our model right now is the experts that we go to for guidance on how we practice the law that we do is through our advisory council, through individuals that have lived experience. And that's what's critical. And that's what helps guide us with our policies and how we move forward. This is just some demographics of the work that we do and who we're serving. When Justice at Last first started, I was doing pro bono work myself before I created Justice at Last, and I was working very closely with MISSSEY. I was working closely with other service providers in the Bay Area. However, they were all primarily serving women and girls. And so if you looked at the demographics in 2015, 2016, 2017, what you would see is primarily all the clients that we were working with were those that had been sex trafficked, and they were all primarily women and girls. And now you see a significant difference where we're working with a lot of individuals that have been labor trafficked. We're still working with individuals that have been sex trafficked. We're still working with women. But it's interesting to know that as the organization developed and learned more about human trafficking and how prevalent labor trafficking is, not just here in the Bay Area, but nationwide and globally, much more than sex trafficking. And however, sex sells, so we see that more in our social media. And then we also know that most of the funding that's dedicated is primarily for those that have been sex trafficked, when we know that a lot of the teens and youth that we work with right now were sex and labor trafficked, and they might not necessarily have been identified as being trafficked at all. So I want to just go back to the definition of human trafficking, because it's really critical to have that groundwork. And so I'm not going to belabor this, but I just want to call out, what are we talking about when we're talking about individuals that have been sex and labor trafficked, and in particular children, right? So you can see this is the federal code, which Charmaine touched on. California law, our penal code, is based on the federal code. And so there's a breakdown of what is sex trafficking and what is labor trafficking. And what's interesting, again, to just keep in mind, is that there's a bit of a disconnect with the law. So sex trafficking is a commercial sex act, includes by force, fraud, or coercion for an adult. For a minor, that requirement is not necessary. There doesn't have to be the force, fraud, or coercion. But we're talking about labor trafficking. For labor trafficking adults and labor trafficking children, we still have to have the force, fraud, and coercion. And so there's this disconnect with the law that we have. And I know we've talked about this and we've belabored it, but that's because we still see it. We still see it in the media where children are called out as prostitutes. So just be mindful of the language when you're working with other service providers, when you're talking to individuals about human trafficking, and in particular, when you're working with youth and young persons, to be mindful of your language. This is just the slide about the labor trafficking. We know that youth don't have agency to consent into a labor contract. You can have individuals that are under 18 that can work, but they have to have legal, either their legal guardian or their parent to authorize that. And yet, again, for individuals that are labor trafficked, and we see this a lot even in the Bay, folks are introduced into trafficking first through the labor and then sex, sometimes at the same time. So let's talk again about what is human trafficking here and from a perspective of children. So this is some data from the TIP report. It's the Trafficking in Persons report. The Department of State issues this every year. We haven't updated our slides, but the data even for now of 2020, or the most recent report, is very similar. 72% of child trafficking victims who received eligibility letters to qualify for support services as victims were labor trafficked victims. And then 66% of trafficked victims, including adults and minors that were served by the Department of Justice grantees, were actually US citizens. So just trying to dispel some myths here, like I think most people feel like if you're trafficked, you're probably a foreign national. That's not the case. Our data doesn't indicate that. And then also, again, looking at who's qualifying for services as victims, there's a higher number of individuals that are receiving services that are labor trafficked victims. So where would young persons and minors be trafficked? It's broken down by sex and labor trafficking. And again, just to keep this in mind when we're talking about individuals and youth in particular, where they're being trafficked. What we see a lot of is young persons who are being sex trafficked, but then they're also charged with, or not charged, but they're responsible for the children of the other individuals that are being trafficked, or the trafficker themselves have children. And so while they're being sex trafficked at night, during the day, they're being forced to be a nanny or to take care, be the caregiver for the children. And so that would qualify for both sex and labor trafficking. We also see individuals that are groomed initially into sex trafficking with a romantic relationship, and then the forced drugs. And subsequently, after the forced drugs take into effect, then we see the sex trafficking occur. So we're just going to touch on the legal needs and remedies. And well, let's just do that first. Let's just do, here it goes. Okay, so this is what we see for the legal needs of trafficked youth. And we're just going to break them down. And while we're talking about crime victim rights, this still falls under the category of crime victim rights. So we're breaking down the individual law that impacts the victim, the survivor. However, the attorney that's helping do this work is doing crime victim rights work because they're working with individuals, minors, who are victims of human trafficking. So we'll specifically talk about crime victim rights within the scope of when a trafficker gets prosecuted. But just take a step back and think about the bigger picture. If you're an immigration attorney and you're working with a minor who's been sex or labor trafficked, you're doing crime victim rights. It's just that sometimes people might not realize or understand that. So that's why we're going to break this down and look at all the common legal needs for youth and young persons, for transitionally aged youth. And if there are any questions, please shout them out. At the moment, I can't see the chat, but just let me know if there's any. So what we talked a lot about yesterday, so we're not going to go into any detail of it, but youth are often charged. And so they need a defender, they need a public defender, and that's, or they might, their family might be able to provide a private defender for them within the juvenile delinquency area. And as of 2017, the laws in California no longer allow for a minor to be charged with prostitution or solicitation. However, we still see youth getting arrested around that same scope. Like maybe the law enforcement officer feels like they're at risk, this individual person. So they feel like the only way to keep her safe, and we've had law enforcement tell us this, is they will go ahead and arrest. It's not going to be prostitution or solicitation. Maybe it's another crime. Maybe she, or this, at least in this image that we're seeing right now, maybe the individual has drug possession on her, or maybe she gets charged with loitering, but then ends up subsequently getting arrested. And so what do you do to address that? Again, we talked about this yesterday about the importance of records clearance and sealing records, and in particular for vacature. Crime victim rights, and we're going to go into much more detail later on in the training, but representing the individual minor or young person as they are slated to testify against their trafficker. Immigration relief. So there definitely are youth that come into the United States for the purpose of trafficking. And so they would be entitled to, in particular, a trafficking visa, a T visa, but there's other forms of immigration relief that they might be eligible for based on the circumstances. So we do see a lot of minors that are in need of immigration relief. And then educational rights. If you imagine that the individual is being trafficked, their likelihood is they're probably not showing up at school on a regular basis. Or if they are, because they're being trafficked at night and then they come to school, school might be a safe place where they're actually not engaging in the academics, they're sleeping. And so what we do see is for a lot of individuals, again, whether sex or labor traffic, they're not able to graduate. And so there's particular rights, and especially if they're being trafficked in different locations and they're getting arrested in one county and then they get transferred back to their home county and then subsequently get trafficked in another county, there's the schooling and the academic, they have rights in order to pursue that, and it's really critical so they can move forward. How are they going to get out of this lifestyle? How are they going to have an opportunity in the future if they're not able to just get a high school diploma? And likewise, like critical, and like the good work that IANGEL is working on, like health rights is so critical for survivors, because if they don't have access to birth control and they are being sex trafficked, or they are being labor trafficked but sexually assaulted by the trafficker, the vulnerabilities just increase. Young persons who are having children, the likelihood of their vulnerability. And what we've also seen is that victims are sometimes have children over the course of the trafficking situation. That child is used to further that exploitation. So it's just critical to be able to have access to birth control. And along those lines, talking about family law and parental rights, the hardest cases that we've ever worked on are individuals who are minors themselves and have children, and are forced to give up their child. So the pregnancy goes to full term, they have the child, they don't want to give up the child, but they're deemed unfit because they themselves have a criminal record as a juvenile delinquent, or that they're deemed a child prostitute. And so those individuals, like everybody else, have rights to parent. And just because they've been exploited doesn't mean that they are an unfit parent. So we see a lot of family law cases, in particular for young persons that have children. And then recovery from identity theft. So many young persons, while they're being trafficked, again, whether sex or labor traffic, the trafficker is stealing their identity. The trafficker is using their social security number to either create fraudulent credit, or or apply for fraudulent health benefits in somebody else's name. And so it's one thing when you're being trafficked and you're out of that situation and you're trying to cooperate with the service providers because that's the only way that you can get housing. And then, you've given a subpoena to turn up and testify in court. And now you're graduating, or you should be graduating, but you don't have the high school diploma. And how are you going to get a job? And forget all of that. If you can't establish any credit, how are you going to, on your own, have the agency and move forward to be successful? So it's really critical and very common, unfortunately, for identity theft to occur for minors and young people. And then what we see is the homelessness, or the inability to have secure and stable housing, and the consequences of that. The vulnerabilities just increase twofold if somebody is homeless. So it's really important. Again, if they're unable to establish credit, how can we help young persons get into housing, safe housing that's stable? So then there's some non-legal needs here, which we don't need to go into. But I think it's critical to say, first and foremost, if we're working with young persons, whether they're a minor or 18, 19, in that TAY age range, how important it is, with everything that they've experienced already, to have healthy relationships and to be able to have some fun and some connectedness to community, and how critical that is. And so as a pro bono attorney or a service provider, it's really critical as an adult to be modeling healthy relationships. And so they can see that in the work, and it also helps with building rapport, obviously, from an attorney perspective, or even just a service provider, as you're trying to move forward and serve the youth. But just also remember, yes, it's critical. We've got to get through this case, but they're also, often children, and again, young adults. And so they also need the ability to process on their terms, right? And we need to be respectful of that, and be mindful that they're young persons. So here's some barriers that we see for survivors when they're just to get assistance, because we've seen many service providers, and I've heard many service providers say, well, why didn't you just leave? Like a statement like that. It's not that simple. It's not that straightforward. Again, be mindful of Andrea said, this person has lived experience that you are not going to know about. You're going to know one little segment, and that might be your focus as an attorney, but there's so much more to this individual from the past and moving forward, and how critical that is, and to not be judgmental, and to just realize that there are barriers to why individuals might not initially seek assistance and support. And in particular, what I want to call out is for Indigenous and American Indian trafficking survivors. There's historically, right, if we just look at historically what's happened, there's this fear and shame, but then there's also what appears to be the community at large doesn't care. A society at large doesn't care. There's so many reports just recently in the past 10 years that have said, identify missing and murdered young women and girls who are American Indians and Indigenous women. And why aren't we more outraged and taking action about that? And then it's important to understand those barriers culturally as we're trying to serve that population in particular. So wanting to just also call that out, because the culture itself might not even be looking at human trafficking as an issue, but we've seen it twofold. So happy to answer any questions if anybody wants to shout out, or let me know if there's any in the chat, because then we'll go right into crime victim rights.
So there are no questions in the chat. I just thought I'd shout that out to you. Also, just FYI, we're actually seeing your next slides and notes. It's fine, but I just wanted to let you know that.
Sure.
If you wanted to.
I think I'd have to stop. I don't know what I have to stop.
Yeah, it's not, I don't know. You might be able just to go into slideshow mode and then catch up, but it's no worries if you don't want to do that. It's fine.
Yeah, if that's
We
okay,
can
if it's
see it
not
all.
distracting to folks, we can just keep it. But if people prefer, I would just need to,
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay.
I just wanted to let you know, just so you know.
thank you. I want to backtrack it. Okay. So what are crime victim rights? So they're a set of comprehensive laws created to preserve the ability of a victim of a crime. So it's available to all victims of crimes, right? Any crime, anybody who's a victim of a crime has rights. And most of us don't know that, right? I mean, if you ask an average person on the street, if you are accused of a crime, do you have rights? They're probably going to say, yes, you have a right to an attorney and you have a right not to talk to the police. Like, I think most people know that, but how many people know that if you're a victim of a crime, that you have a right to an attorney? How many of you know that you have actual rights as the prosecution moves forward of the defendant, the accused who committed the crime? Not so many. And, you know, I think the disconnect there is because if you are accused of a crime and you can't afford an attorney, one will be provided to you. And that's not the instance here for crime victim rights. If you're a victim of a crime and you want an attorney, you have to be able to afford it. And so that's why it's so critical that our work at Justice at Last focuses on providing free legal services for survivors of human trafficking, and in particular, crime victim rights, because we know that survivors, when they're being trafficked, day in and day out, there's coercion. There's this constant and regular threat about you should not tell anybody about what's happening to you. If you do, there's serious consequences, including your life. And so it's important for victims, and in particular minors who have been trafficked, and young persons as well, that they have representation, that they have an attorney that can go into the courtroom and ensure that their rights are adhered to as victims. So crime victim rights, we didn't see, they're relatively new. 2004 was the first federal laws that we had that were protecting victims of any crime. And this just kind of highlights what those rights were: to be reasonably protected, to be treated with fairness, to be treated with respect and dignity, to be informed of a plea bargain as it's moving forward, you know, to confer with the prosecutors. You don't have the ability as a victim to tell the prosecutor, you got to do this, but instead you have the right to confer and to talk about the case. What is the prosecutor doing? What is the plan to move forward and to prosecute and charge the traffickers? And then also access to restitution. So we've got that at the federal level, which is great. And that was as of 2004. But nationwide, not all states have crime victim rights. In fact, the states in the red that you see here, there's no victim rights in their individual constitutions. And then the rest of them have some form of crime victim rights in their constitution. And California amended our constitution in 2004. In 2008. And so we do have crime victim rights. So that if there's a trafficker that's being prosecuted at the federal level, there's crime victim rights. And if they're being prosecuted at the state level, then there's crime victim rights. And the California crime victim rights are pretty broad and very good. I mean, as long as they're adhered to. And so again, it's really critical how many victims actually know they have rights. And if they don't know that, what's going to happen in the courtroom, where the defendant's attorney's goal is to show that their client is innocent. And how do they do that? They're going to pick apart and pick at holes from the prosecutor as they present their case. And so what does that mean? As the victim goes forward and takes the stand, the defense attorney is going to be very critical of the victim that's testifying and talk about, well, isn't it true that you were previously arrested for prostitution and solicitation? Isn't it true that you have, in the past have 20 convictions on loitering? And so again, they have rights. The role of the prosecutor is to move the case forward, and they're representing the state. So it's so important that that victim, minor or young person, have representation. And so what are the fundamental rights that we see and that we end up spending a lot of time with on our cases? And so it's encompassing this large. Again, we talked about a little bit about conferring with the prosecutor to find out what's going on. Another thing that's critical with crime victim rights is that applying for victim compensation. So all victims have a right to apply for victim compensation for any out-of-pocket expenses that may have occurred. But in particular, in California, we've got a law that allows for survivors of human trafficking, whether sex or labor trafficked, regardless of minors or adults, that if there was wage theft involved and they were never paid for whatever the services were that they provided, that they can apply for additional victim compensation. It's $20,000, it's $10,000 maximum per year for up to 2 years. And it's really important if you're working with a victim and they're interested in looking at compensation for lost wages, that they're working closely with the victim rights attorney if the trafficker is being prosecuted, because that information, that application is a little bit complicated and detailed. And so usually what ends up happening is the victims will work with either the victim witness unit in the district attorney's office or working with the crime victim rights attorney to ensure that if they are going to apply for that compensation, that they wait until after the end of the trafficking prosecution for a couple of reasons. There's a possibility that as the prosecution moves forward and it's successful and there's a guilty verdict or there's a plea, that the victim would be entitled to restitution, and the restitution might be higher than what they would get through the victim compensation. So it's really important that they're working closely with the crime victim rights attorney and or the victim witness unit to ensure that the individual victim is not getting the wage compensation prior to the end of the prosecution, final adjudication of the trafficker. So, due process, fairness, dignity, and respect, that doesn't often happen. And especially like we talked about yesterday, if there's an individual who has been arrested and has never found any quote unquote justice from the legal system, because as a victim, they were forced to commit a crime. And then as a victim, they were arrested. And the legal system has deemed them as perpetrators. They're not going to feel like, they're not going to embrace the subpoena that they just got to come up and testify against the trafficker. And so it's really important that they be treated and identified, as a survivor. And I kind of, again, going back to what Andrea talked about is, treating individuals with dignity and understanding where they're coming from and providing them with education and so they can understand the process. So many of our young people, in particular minors, but then also the young people and adults, don't really understand the legal system. And so they might be connected to a victim witness advocate, which they're grateful for. However, they don't really understand the role of a victim witness advocate. Anything that's shared with that victim witness advocate could potentially, more than likely, be turned over to the defense. So if the first time a survivor is out of the trafficking situation and they're connected to a victim witness advocate within the DA's office, and they share things like, well, I wasn't forced, he's my boyfriend, I wanted to do that. No, he didn't make me, I put the quota on myself. I made those choices. Those initial statements that end up being disclosed to the victim witness advocate are turned over to the prosecution, which then has to turn them over to the defense. And so that's going to help the defense, because then the defense will say, well, isn't it true that you were never forced? We have you saying that you were willing to do that and you were selling yourself. Fast forward, that individual, maybe 6 months, maybe a year later, realizes, well, wait a minute, actually, I was forced. and I am a survivor of human trafficking. That information still didn't disclose to the victim witness advocate. So it's really critical when we're working with survivors of trafficking that they understand the roles within the legal system of who's doing what. Now, a community-based advocate, like someone at MISSSEY, would be completely different. There's going to be confidentialities there that are going to be protected. So if that individual made those same statements to the MISSSEY advocate, the case manager, that's protected. That's not going to be disclosed in the prosecution of the trafficker. So it's one thing for us as attorneys to really understand what the crime victim rights are, but then going back to, we need to educate the clients that we're working with, and in particular minors, to understand the players and the consequences of if they are sharing, like, who do you trust? Again, it goes back to the trauma-informed training that we had that started off today. It's so important for individuals to be given that knowledge so they can make the choices for themselves instead of being told that they have to do this or that. Let's see. I also want to talk about restitution. And so again, any victim of a crime is entitled and can ask for restitution. But when we're talking about survivors, in particular for sex trafficking, it's really important to understand the ill-gotten gains and what that means. So for ill-gotten gains, for restitution to show the harm, the court needs to understand, you know, what has happened. And so there's a guilty verdict and they're deciding, well, what should the appropriate restitution be? Well, we know that the individual that was sex trafficked had a quota. They had a nightly quota of, let's just say $500 a night, and they were trafficked for a year and a half, and they got 2 nights off that they remember specifically. So they were working every day over that course of a year and a half. And so we would calculate that quota that they had of $500 a night, and we would present that dollar figure to the court. And we would also look at the hours that they were forced to work and calculate that rate at a minimum wage rate. Now I'm not saying that being sex trafficked is the equivalent of minimum wage, but the court needs to gauge and understand the dollar value of what's transpired and how that trafficker, who's now been found guilty of the trafficking, made money off that victimhood of that individual. And so we present the court based on the ill-gotten gains calculations, and then the minimum wage for whatever, you know, the state that individual is at, and the court can see the 2 different dollar amounts, and the court will decide what is an appropriate form of restitution. And so it's really important when we're talking about victims of trafficking, that they know their rights and that those dollar figures, those restitution calculations, are presented to the court. Also part of the course of a prosecution that's really critical for a crime victim rights attorney to be working with the victim, the minor, young person, is the sentencing and the impact statement, and how important it is for that impact statement. It's that opportunity for that individual to tell the court what happened to them. So that maybe they've already been on the stand if it went to full trial, or maybe they didn't have to take the stand. Maybe the trafficker accepted a plea. And so the impact statement is an opportunity for the survivor to share what happened to them from their perspective. And advocates can help with that as well, but it's really important if we're talking about the victim is also seeking restitution, that what's crafted in that impact statement is the quotas and the dates and as much facts as we can get. And so that's why it's critical to be working with a crime victim rights attorney at that stage of a case if it moves forward like that. And then the other thing I would talk about is this notice and standing. So you have to show, as attorneys, we know that you're going to have to show that they're standing. There is standing if they're a victim. They do have a right to an attorney. That's all case law that we have, and some of that's actually provided in the handouts. But the notice, the right to get notice and to know what's happening, it's often a challenge. So when we are working with a minor or a young person and we're representing them as a crime victim rights attorney over the course of the prosecution of a trafficker, usually what happens is when we go into court, The judge doesn't know who we are, what we're doing, why are we there, why are we disrupting the court, not understanding that there's crime victim rights. And so often it's a learning opportunity to educate the court. Hopefully by that point, we've already introduced ourselves to the prosecution, because it's really critical to work in partnership. While our role is completely different than a prosecutor. The prosecutor is trying to move their case forward, and often they might see a crime victim rights attorney as somebody who's threatening their ability to build rapport with the victim as they present their case. And that's, we want to just make them understand that we're not there to interfere with the prosecution. We're there to ensure that the victim, the minor, and the young person's rights are adhered to over the course of the prosecution of the trafficker. And so getting notice, often courts will order the prosecutor to ensure that the victim rights attorney is given notice.
Rose, can I break in with a quick question before you move on? Somebody asked, what can minors get from crime victims compensation or victim of crimes compensation if they don't have lost wages?
So it'd be any out-of-pocket expenses, and that might be like maybe their family had to relocate. And so the cost of moving, or maybe they needed to get a security system, or maybe their jaw was broken and they had to pay out-of-pocket expenses to get their jaw, healed, and then a replacement of teeth or any dental work that might have been done. And maybe they didn't have to pay the bill up front, but they had to do a copay. It's a host of opportunities to get reimbursed. Maybe their cell phone was stolen, or their clothing, or whatever it is, any personal property. And then the parameters would be that the crime had to occur, so statements have to be made in the application itself, and then providing some type of documentation about what the loss was. So it can be a sworn statement, can be receipts, especially if we're talking about a minor. Hopefully the parent or legal guardian has some form of documentation to show the costs involved. But it could also be the individual needs and wants to get therapy and to process everything that's happened. And so they can't afford to go to a therapist. So maybe they go to a therapist that the California Victims Compensation has already authorized as somebody that they work with, that can be billed directly rather than having that individual be billed. Or if they have had to make out-of-pocket co-payments, again, they could get reimbursed for that.
Thanks. There's also a couple somewhat unrelated questions, but one is, how many clients do you serve at one time? And the other is, what percentage, and I don't know if you would know this, maybe Charmaine would, what percentage of traffickers are prosecuted?
So that, you definitely would want to throw that question to the DA's office. I mean, you can look at the data within the TIP report. We'll have data referencing federal prosecutions for sex and labor. And then it's harder to get the state data, but you'd have to go to the California Department of Justice. And I think the data there is about 5 years behind. So I think the timeline right now of data that's released is probably, well, I don't know, it's like 2017, maybe 2016. So that's a good question to throw to the prosecution if you want to send that to Charmaine, because I think she did share with the data, at least the current data. And I think some of the flyers reference their data since Heat Watch has started. So I would go to them for an answer on that. And then, I'm sorry, the other question, how many clients do we serve?
Yes, how many clients do you serve at one time?
So right now, I think we've got active about 69 or 70 clients. And that doesn't mean we're in court at 60 different courts, because every case is different. And we're doing a lot of different practices, right? We're not just doing crime victim rights representation. We're doing immigration law. We're doing family law. So the cases might be in different stages at any one time. I mean, I think like for court appearances this week, we had 3 court appearances for different cases in different jurisdictions. Does that mean that, one attorney is working on 20 cases at a time? We tag team it. We're small but mighty, and so we're working together and supporting one another. But if that helps with the numbers, it's not like I'm in court for all 70 clients every day, because that's not the case. Like, we've got one case that's coming up in San Mateo County will be a full-on trial, and there we're representing over 40 clients. And so that will, if you ask me that question next month, it'd be a little bit different than where we're at right now, where we've got a court appearance here and there throughout the Bay Area.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So I just want to show, I think Charmaine briefly talked about the Epstein case yesterday, or at least highlighted it. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're trying to understand crime victim rights, because this, again, is relatively new law, and we don't know a lot about it. And if you look back at what happened in the Epstein case, and he's now since committed suicide, but in the early 2000s, I want to say 2008, I think, he actually accepted a plea bargain for the sex trafficking of a minor. He was, and this is all, so he's a financer, like he had multi-million-dollar millionaire. And it appears that there was some unlawful between the prosecution, a plea deal that was inappropriate, that at a minimum violated crime victim rights. The victims were never told about this plea. And so the plea was, I think, that he was supposed to be served 18 months in jail. But the reality was, I think he did 13. And of those 13, he was allowed to go into his office and work every day. And in the evenings is when he would actually return to the jail. And there were, at that time, back in 2008 or whatever the time frame was, there was numerous minor victims who had come forward. None of them were appraised of the plea. Nobody ever found out what had happened. And then several years later, we fast forward to, I believe, 2018, 2019, there's a formal investigation about what transpired, and he gets charged again for the other victims, the numerous victims, I believe primarily in New York and in Florida. And then while he's being charged, before he's actually brought to justice, he commits suicide. Currently, I don't know if she's deemed the fiance or the ex-girlfriend who was arranging for the youth to have sex with him, is currently on trial right now in New York. And I think that is slated, the trial is supposed to start in November. And so I bring this up just because this deals with crime victim rights at its heart. So there are numerous victims that had come forward and nobody took them seriously. And so that's the frustration that we see with a lot of survivors. And, again, if they're being arrested and told that they're criminals and then not listening to the full scope of the story about who's purchasing and who's buying, it just adds further to the harm about what transpires here. So there was, they had a right to restitution. And I think now that he's deceased, I think there's some serious litigation that's going on over his assets, but I have not been following that. But I just wanted to bring this to your attention. If you've heard and you're aware of the case, it'll be interesting to see how this moves forward with the prosecution of the girlfriend or fiance. So I'm being mindful of time. I just want to give you a synopsis, hypothetical of Jane Doe. And Jane Doe, at the age of, I think it's 14, ends up being trafficked. Now, this is somebody she falls in love with. It's an older boyfriend. He tells her, he learns all of her dreams and goals in life. And he says, you've never been to Disneyland. I want to take you to Disneyland. Let's go. And so she tells her mom that she's going to spend the night at a friend's house, and they leave to go to Disneyland. Well, they do go to Los Angeles. However, they don't go to Disneyland. Instead, the boyfriend proceeds to sex traffic her the entire weekend. And he says things like, you have to do it. I already have pictures of you nude. I'm going to tell your mom if you don't. And so over the course of the weekend, she ends up being sex trafficked with numerous purchaser buyers. And then he leaves Monday morning to go to the bank. And at that point, she calls her mom to tell her mom, what should I do? I'm in Los Angeles. I'm sorry that I lied to you. And the mom says, call the police. I mean, just call, I don't know what you should do, call the police. So she does call the police. This happens in 2015, 2016. So it's before the law in 2017 where it says girls and boys, any minor can't be charged with prostitution or solicitation. So she calls the police, law enforcement shows up, and she's arrested for prostitution and solicitation, even though she herself is a victim. And then she also, over the course of this relationship with this older man, she has an addiction to primarily alcohol and drugs. And so she gets put on probation, and she gets transferred about 100 miles away from her home family to go through a program for young girls who are prostitutes who have an addiction issue. And over the course of that program, she ends up meeting another person who she believes loves her and supports her, and he ends up being a second trafficker. So she ends up getting trafficked again. However, this time she comes back to the program and the social worker there, and she discloses what happens. They call the police. Luckily, she doesn't get arrested this time. And she helps the police to track down the second trafficker. So I'm sharing all this with you because this is what, over the course of this is what we typically see when we're talking about youth, is they're sharing their story, and they may or may not be heard. They may or may not be believed, and how critical it is as an attorney or a service provider to listen and believe what you're being told. And then, so the second trafficker ends up getting arrested. There's actually two traffickers. They both get arrested. And she's in her program and she's moving forward. And about 9 months later, the deputy district attorney shows up at her program at the home where she's living, along with a law enforcement officer, and they serve her a subpoena. And they say, you're going to have to come to court and you're going to have to testify. And she said, well, I already told you everything I know. Why do I need to testify? Well, I don't understand. And well, because unfortunately, the youth, and most victims don't know this, is once you've made a statement to law enforcement and you've provided evidence about what has happened, that crime, that now the prosecutor is relying on that to move forward on a prosecution, which means you're probably more than likely going to get served a subpoena to come to court and testify. And she says, well, I can't do that because he threatened me and I can't see him again because he's going to come after me and kill me. And the prosecution says, well, you're going to have to, the prosecutor, the deputy DA says, you're going to have to show up to court because here's the subpoena that you're being served. And if you don't, you're going to be held in contempt of court. And the judge will put you in jail and you'll be fined a fee. And at this point, Jane Doe is breaking down and crying because she doesn't understand. She's already helped the police find the bad guys. What does she have to do now? And her social worker says, well, does she have any rights? Does she need an attorney? Does Jane Doe need an attorney? And the response back from the deputy district attorney is she doesn't have any rights and she can't have an attorney, which is completely untrue. And I'm sharing this story because it's, on the one hand, it's a hypothetical. On the other hand, it's a compilation of different clients that we've represented where people, even within the prosecution unit, still don't understand the full scope of the rights of victims. And then the consequences of that. Was Jane Doe treated with respect and dignity? I would say not. And she was given misinformation. And then luckily, down the road, she ends up getting connected with a crime victim rights attorney, and working, the crime victim rights attorney ends up working with the prosecution so that it doesn't go to full trial. She doesn't have to testify, and there is a plea bargain. And so it's critical for the work as a crime victim rights attorney to be representing survivors again, because young people are already so vulnerable and they're already being told what they have to do, what they can do, what they can't do. And so quite often they'll turn away and run if they're not being listened to. And so that's why it's so important that minors of trafficking have representation, because so many of them, like we've heard over the course of the 2 days, they've already been exposed to some form of child abuse or neglect. And they have negative experiences with systems and what they've experienced in their own life and culture with oppression. And so it's really important that they have representation. So what happens if crime victim rights are enforced? There's studies that track this, that the victims become empowered because of that process. If somebody's listening to them, they're treating them with dignity. It validates the victimhood and it helps them move forward into process. And to, if they're processing within the system, the prosecution, they can have access to restitution. What happens if their rights are not adhered to or they're ignored? The victim, the survivor, re-experiences victimization again. And remember, the likelihood is they've probably already been deemed a perpetrator. So Jane Doe was already charged and she had to accept a plea and she was put on probation and she was taken away from her family and put in a rehab, addiction program for children that were quote unquote prostitutes. So the language now, to again be mindful, we've come away from that based on the law, but this is still happening. And just think about the impact of that on that individual person, because they're deemed a hostile witness, especially if they show up to testify and they don't want to testify. They're horrified to make statements. They're 5 feet away from the trafficker who's threatened them day in and day out while they were being trafficked. There's serious consequences from that. And then here's just more data that talks about what happens to the impact of victims when they're interacting with the legal system, and if their perspective, where they're being blamed for what's happened. And we see that a lot, especially by, again, a defense attorney representing their client. Their job is to ensure that there's not a not guilty verdict. And so how are they going to do that? They're going to turn around and blame the victim. So the only thing I want to add to this before we finish is the stages of change. I think it's really important to understand the stages of change when you're working with victims that are minors or young persons that have been sex trafficked in particular. Because, you can apply the stages of change to anything. If you're trying to diet and lose weight, you're trying to stop smoking, there's a process that we go through, all of us, about when we're trying to make changes in our own life, and how you need to understand that when you're working with a survivor that's been sex trafficked, and where they might fall on the spectrum while you're working for them. So if you're working with somebody who has no intention of changing the behavior, that this is my boyfriend, I don't identify as a victim, the likelihood is you're not going to be able to represent them as a victim of human trafficking. So you just need to really be mindful about this spectrum. And MISSSEY does a fabulous training on the stages of change that maybe, individually you can reach out and have another training with them. But it's just something that you need to be mindful of when you're recognizing who it is that you're working with. And then this, I think, is the same slide from yesterday. And you already had a phenomenal training earlier about how to be trauma informed, but just be, how important that is to understand in order to be able to come at your advocacy with this approach. So I think that's about it. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Rose. We actually do have a couple questions. The first one is, do you have any advice for dealing with DAs who are not trauma informed or are not prioritizing a minor victim's needs?
Definitely challenges. I've had experiences, not in Alameda County, I have to say, but in other counties in the Bay Area, where the understanding, the perspective from the district attorney is that this person is a prostitute. That's the attitude when we're talking about children. So, I try to just come at it from, this is an education opportunity, and to be consistent with my language, to be consistent with the facts about human trafficking, whether it's sex or labor traffic. And it's successful. It's painful because it's slow. It's a slow process. But I think if you're showing up and you're being respectful when you're communicating with the district attorney, will go a long way. And just be able to re-educate and re-educate and re-educate, and don't ever feel like that's a chore, because it makes a difference. It really does. It'll make an impact, not just with that prosecutor, but then also the staff, and also within the legal system with the judge and the clerks, the law enforcement present, the bailiffs. It really makes a difference, but it's frustrating. So you have to be persistent.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next, and this is the final question that I see, I believe, is what is proper service of a subpoena for a minor victim who is a foster youth? And it's two questions. Who is responsible for ensuring that minors testify, and are there consequences if they don't?
So there can be consequences if they're properly served. So how do you serve? So usually for a minor, they're going to do something very similar to what Jane Doe went through. They're going to show up at wherever the youth resides, and they're going to literally hand the physical subpoena. There might be instances now during COVID where it's being emailed, but I would argue that that wouldn't be a proper service, especially if we're talking about a minor. But then giving that to the guardian or whoever is legally responsible for that minor. And then you could, as an attorney, you could, if those facts don't occur, you could say that it's improper service. But the reality is the prosecution is probably going to want that individual to testify. So at that point, you have an opportunity to build a relationship with the prosecutor to see if there's any other opportunities to move forward to bring that trafficker to justice, where if your victim does not want to testify, they can reach some type of plea agreement. So victims don't get to, again, tell the prosecutor, you have to, I'm not going to testify, so you got to have to accept a plea. That is not how it works, but making sure that the young person understands that they do have a right to tell the prosecutor what their preference is, for sure. Sorry, what was the other question now?
So I think you answered both of those, but there's one more now. How have you been able to balance your client's right not to be re-traumatized into testifying in open court against a trafficker with the trafficker's right to confront the accuser?
So California has got some, it's not a great law, but it's an improved law. Prior to, again, I think 2017 is where the law shifts. If you were a minor and you were under the age of 13, you could request testimonial accommodations. Since then, the law has changed, and now I believe it's 15 and under. So, and it's still it's not impacting the defendant's right to confront the accuser if they have accommodations. Accommodations are allowed, and that's one of the things that we really encourage for minors, whether sex or labor trafficked, to be able to get those accommodations. So the accommodations could be as something as a support person who's in the courtroom with them, or that they are not actually in the courtroom and that their testimony is being live fed into the courtroom, which we're seeing more and more now, not for the sake of victims, but because of the COVID world that we have. And that will, move forward, I'm sure, and go through the Supreme Court as cases move forward with criminal prosecutions. But victims have rights to testimonial accommodations. And so if they're over that range, if they're 16 and 17, they're still a minor, it's going to be a little bit more challenging to seek those accommodations. But you can, if it's one thing if the person just doesn't want to testify, it's quite another if they are having a panic attack because of the complex trauma that they've had, and the psychiatrist and the counselor are recommending that this individual should not have to confront and testify in front of, and then you'd have to present that petition, and you'd have to provide an affidavit, probably by an individual who's done a forensic exam. And so we've done that. It's not been held that the defendant didn't have a right to confront the accused It's usually the reality of what ends up happening is the survivor doesn't want to go through that and they run. It's super common for minors to just go MIA. So that's the more common when we're talking about if there's been a subpoena for a minor just to testify against their trafficker.
Thanks for that answer. Although it's, you know, a sad circumstance, the complexities of this type of practice.
It is. And so you'll often, and, you know, again, you could throw this question to Charmaine or any prosecutors generally, is that why you don't see that many charges of human trafficking? Maybe the individual is charged with pimping and pandering. It's easier to move that prosecution forward successfully and even potentially get a plea than it would be for human trafficking charges. If you're the victim survivor is not willing to participate in that prosecution, that's why we're seeing lesser charges go forward for those individuals that, you know, but for having that testimony. And so it's a framework that we need to change of our legal system. If we're requiring the victim to testify in order for there to be a successful prosecution, you're not going to get that many prosecutions. And we need to come at it being trauma informed. What does that mean? The trauma that's there to move forward and testify. Again, if somebody's been day in and day out coerced about the consequences if they testify.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you being here a second day and providing that really important training. I think a lot of attorneys and a lot of people in the general public just don't know how much you do for crime victims who are trafficking survivors and how that system works as well. So it's very much appreciated. Thanks everybody for joining us. And again, thanks so much to Rose, also to MISSSEY and to the Alameda County DA's office for partnering with us, as well as to Queen's Bench for the MCLE credit. We really appreciate everybody attending, and you'll get a recording soon. We wish you all a great week. Take care.